I've attempted to try and summarize what I think are some of the interesting themes that were coming out. Thank you. And in this particular session, which is how are religious and scientific beliefs acquired? Well, I think some of the common themes for the three talks is that, first of all, there's no inherent difference necessarily, or at least there's a lot of similarities between religions and science, because they are, as a couple of talks have pointed out, they're addressing explanations for what are unobservable phenomena by inferring the presence of these invisible mechanisms and entities. The other surprising thing I found was that in both domains, there's quite a lot of reliance on testimony, even in fairly scientifically literate, well-educated individuals, that they can spout off the mechanism, but then when they're asked about it a little bit more thoroughly, it turns out that their justification very often defers to their professor, which is kind of reassuring if you're a professor. One of the important themes, I think, is, and certainly this is something very central to my agenda, is that I think it's not inconsistent that we can occupy with different modes of reasoning. And I think the evidence is quite clear on that. And yet, as Cristine pointed out in the last talk, that's not the way it's often presented to the general public. It's often set up as a very antagonistic debate between science versus religion. And I think Cristine's point is well made, that really if we can start to inform others to the extent to which there is actually a lot of convergence or coexistence, that's actually in our interest to do so. And finally, what I felt was coming out of the number of talks was, in a sense, there's a difference between endorsing or accepting a position and literally understanding what that entails. It's almost as if they're kind of politically divisive or banners under which people see themselves. And as I'll explain, I think it's quite, and I do know individuals like that. They say that they're really into science, and then you discover actually it's not that they're into science, they're just into rejecting religion. And so that's an important point to remember. Okay, so the individual talks. Paul skipped over many slides, so I'm going to have to try to imagine what you were probably going to say. But this is what I did get. I actually had prepared another slide for you, Paul, based on the chapter you'd sent through, so I had to abandon that, delete that one. Yeah. It's really hard being a discussant, by the way. I should just point that out. But anyway, from what I got from your talk, first of all, this is, the children do have an amazing capacity for imagining the invisible. And this is evidenced in their, capacity for pretend play, and their capacity to entertain counterfactuals. And I think this is a point which was touched upon actually in the first session. I think Jackie mentioned this, that in developing conceptual frameworks, there's an extent to which you almost have to be aware of what is impossible in order to understand what is possible. So I would argue that actually it's invariably true that to have a sort of natural understanding of the world, you have to be aware of what makes something supernatural. So I don't think you can just say that's a way of thinking that you're never going to entertain, because it's part of the process. But when you are in a situation where you can't see everything, it's clear that children use testimony quite a lot. And again, this is a theme, I think, across the three talks, is the tension or the alternative explanations for beliefs as the tension between believing what you're told in testimony and this alternative view, which is that many of the things we believe emerge spontaneously as a consequence of our cognitive biases. Hi, what does that mean? I thought you were saying hello. All right. Okay. All right, I'll move it up a bit faster there. Okay. And the long and short of what Paul was saying is that your context, your schooling, strongly influences the extent to which you will believe in individuals with special powers. So that is very much in the camp of testimony, is one of the major driving mechanisms. Okay. Andrew presented a variety of information dealing with the adults, of course. And again, this similar theme was testimony coming up. And I like the anecdote about students sort of saying, well, it's just what my professor told me. I think that's interesting. And there's a lot of similarities that he noted. And it turns out this deferential or relying on testimony appears again to be this very strong driving mechanism. And less to do with actually understanding the science. And I think this is a good point. I think that even many of my students, I'm sure many professors here will know this, that very often they're not really that sure about the process of what science is. And I know some colleagues who are not that sure about it as well. When it comes to what is this, how do you go about the process of science? What does it mean about setting up testable hypotheses? I mean, there are some remarkable gaps, I think, when it comes to understanding exactly how the process works. So there are many misconceptions. And certainly in the general public, that is very true. They always complain, as you've probably noted, whenever they bring on a scientist, that they never give a straight answer. And that's, of course, because they can't necessarily give straight answers. So they talk about likelihoods and probabilities, which, of course, opens up the door for anyone who wants to reject science. Well, you can't prove that ghosts don't exist, therefore they are possible. And then Cristine started off by reminding us about the problem. And it's not a trivial issue. It is actually quite an antagonistic debate, which has consequences. And it is important that we do try to engage the public with this. There is a science of superstition. There is a scientific approach to try and understand why people believe. And rather than just telling people that they're idiots or stupid, you're preaching to the choir. You're never going to change someone's opinion by using that approach. You've really got to think about how you can present the message in a much more acceptable way. And the truth of the matter is that we do not neatly divide into believers and non-believers. There's a coexistence in most of us. As you'll see, if you come along to tonight's lecture, I'll be demonstrating that all of us entertain manners of supernatural beliefs. I don't see it being the case that it's all in the individual or all in society. Clearly, the two things are working together. And within an individual, of course, they can integrate them and synthesize and come up with very sophisticated ways of combining natural and supernatural explanations. And again, Cristine's work on biological concepts in Africa, notions of viruses and how these operate, is a very good example of that. And the other point, of course, that Cristine talked about is emotion. Emotion was mentioned again this morning. There are rapid ways of seeing the world and understanding the world, and very often they just seem right. And we often forget that knowledge is not independent of emotion. Classic studies showing that if you disconnect emotional centers from the reasoning center of the brain, people are just not sure anymore. So we must never underestimate the importance of emotion in giving you a sense of what is right. And that's also the issue when it comes to dealing with questions or topics which are emotive, namely the existential questions of why we're here. What is love? What's the point of anything? These are emotional questions. They're not clinical. So I'll just say a little bit briefly about work from my lab. Because I come from the perspective is that clearly testimony plays a very important role, but I think it kind of works because we tend to believe what we'd like to be true. I'm an advocate of the type 1, type 2 intuitive, fast reasoning kind of research from Deb Kellerman and a variety of Pascal Boilly's work. It's true, people do seem to find sort of religious ideas very easy, very quick to accept. And you put them in situations where you pit the two against each other, they'll invariably go for the quicker one first of all. That doesn't mean that you always defer to that, but it means it's always there. And I've been engaging on a program of work where you can reveal using implicit measures or other types of techniques that people harbor both modes of thinking. And even though you might be able to become scientifically literate and be very vocal and open about what you believe are the scientific laws of the world, deep down you still harbor all manner of notions and beliefs. And if the context is right, those can reemerge. So we've been looking at various forms of belief. And by the way, I tend not to look at religious beliefs. I'm much more interested in secular supernatural beliefs. I think that's a point worth remembering. Not all supernatural thinking is religious. And for me, I think this is something that's often forgotten, because you get many atheists who reject religion. What they're really rejecting are traditional religions, and they're failing to recognize within themselves all modes of supernatural notions, luck, fate, things like that. But we work on moral contagion. This is based on Paul Rosin's work. You basically don't want to wear the clothing of a killer. You don't want to touch people that you think are evil. These are, if they were true, would represent supernatural type explanations. Now, that doesn't mean they're not adaptive. We don't know why people are evil. Maybe there is some biological contaminant. Maybe it's a good thing not to touch them. But this becomes strangely manifest in all manner of things. Why you won't want to live in a house where murder took place, all these sorts of things. And we've shown that, if you take adults who consider themselves to be entirely logical, they will not wear the killer carding, or at least they'll wash their hands afterwards, because they feel there's something that has, some cooties, as somebody said this morning, that has infected them. Voodoo. Well, everyone knows that voodoo is not real, but if you ask children, they are confused about appearance and reality. We've shown studies that if you take a photograph of an object and then you alter the photograph, you make it wet, for example, they think the object in the other room has somehow become damp. So they're not clear yet between the notion of relationships between representations and reality. And we've shown that adults, again, who claim to be entirely reasonable and rational, if you ask them to destroy photographs of their loved ones, they probably won't do it. And if they do it, we've shown that their deep-seated anxiety as revealed by galvanic skin responses firing through the window. So they can say, yes, explicitly I don't have a problem with it, but deep down they do, obviously. Anthropomorphism, we do talk to things, don't we? We talk to our computers, our cars, and I do studies of adults who still have their childhood teddy bears, and they treat them as if they're sentient, get lonely, and all manner of things. And we've done implicit attitudes tests as well. They actually, they think of them as having minds. And then mind-body dualism, probably the most difficult one for us to reject, because it just is the nature of the phenomenology of consciousness. We feel our minds are separate to our bodies. That's what we all feel. But the neuroscience says very differently in that. And so we've been looking at that using duplication scenarios, showing that, again, the tendency or the default is to assume this position. Will science ever replace religion? That was a question I think many of us were asked to answer yesterday. We went and filmed some things for your laboratory. And I think this is part of the issue about the relationship between science and religion. First of all, I think you've got to recognize, as I've already said, there's a difference between religions, which are organized systems, and the secular supernatural beliefs that many of us have. And they can arise spontaneously. They don't need to be through indoctrination. As I said earlier, I think that natural concepts by default will evoke supernatural boundaries. And so I think they're always going to be part and parcel of the way that we reason about the world. Science has different levels of explanation. There is no unifying theory. And indeed, even in scientific theories, levels of explanation are sometimes incommensurate. So you can have a theory of atoms which has nothing to say about a theory about how flight works. And this is, you can have people in different departments working on the same problem, coming up with different explanations. For example, memory. That's a very good example. We get neurobiologists working on long-term potentiation, and that has almost nothing or really little relevance to something like a psychological theory of working memory. But they're both dealing with memory. So if people in the general public, they have a misconception that we're all sort of playing or working in the same territories, which isn't entirely true. Historical perspectives. Well, when you try to get rid of religion, history tells us it just pops back into place or reemerges or morphs into something else. I don't think it's the case that we can easily get rid of it. Even in secular societies in Scandinavia, yes, they don't endorse as many religious beliefs, but then they have all other manner of notions which are equally supernatural. And then we must remember, of course, it's very adaptive way of dealing with things. For people, religion for them offers some form of explanation. So having superstitions means that you can endure things. That's why sportsmen have superstitions. It makes them play better. If you thwart them in their ability to do their rituals, they're not as good. So it does actually have some benefits in that situation. And of course, it's very adaptive for groups. If you want to coalesce a group, create a religion. Religions signify to others that you trust them because you're willing to believe things on faith in the absence of evidence. So it's a powerful mechanism for signaling allegiances. And of course, then there's the big one. They address the existential questions of why we're here. So I just want to end up with a cartoon I just got off the internet. So it reminded me, people think they really, there's this rise in love of science. And very often when you ask people about science, it turns out they don't actually really know a lot about science. So we have, do you know what the human hair and nails are made from the same kind of stuff? Man, I really love science. Well, I'm not sure you really understand or love science. When you say you love something, you just don't love the exciting and fun parts. You love the boring parts just as much. People who truly love science spend their lives studying the tedious little bits as well as the flashy facts. You don't love science. You're looking at its butt when it walks by. Thank you.